Welcome to another episode of the Dialectic at Work, a podcast dedicated to understanding Marxian theory, its philosophy, its politics, and its economics. I'm your host, Shahram Azhar. I'm Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University. Most things in life, such as automobiles, cancer, lovers, are important only to those who have them. Money, in contrast, is equally important to those who have it and those who don't. Both, accordingly, have a concern for understanding it. Both should proceed in the full confidence that they can. So writes John Kenneth Galbraith in this famous book on money. But what is money? This question may seem obvious at first glance. However, as we discover in this episode, there is more to it than meets the eye. Some claim that we are now entering a new monetary world with bitcoins and cryptocurrency and Ethereum and all the rest of it, while others are less optimistic about a new monetary world within the capitalist economy. To make sense of all of this week, the Dialectic goes to work to explore and analyze the question of money with, as always, my mentor, my teacher, and the number one Marxist economist in the world, Professor Richard Wolff. How are you, Rick, today?
Okay, very glorious introduction. I'll have to hire you as my front man in the future just to open the show.
Thank you, Rick. Rick, since you studied both economics and history at the highest level and at the best in the premier institutions of the world, I wanted to ask a rather simple, perhaps naive question. In your studies, in your analysis, in your explorations in history and economics, what do we know about money?
Yes, we know it has mystified and entranced people from as far back as we have any historical record. And in a way, there should be no great surprise at that. Think about money in the following way, and you can see how entrancing it is. In a typical monetized economy, that means an economy where money plays an important role, and it doesn't in all economies, but in those where it does, money has this magical quality. You can exchange it for anything. Almost everything in a monetized economy is available to you if you have the money to pay for it. If you go to a market where money is normal, the money is how you buy a bag of potatoes or a haircut or a song or a chair or anything else. It's clear that the money isn't the thing. There's something symbolic. There's something immense, universal, enormous about money. Because if you arrive with a shirt, you're going to have a much, much harder time converting that into a bag of potatoes or into a chair or anything else. Money is this kind of, if I can quote, universal equivalent. It has this magical property. And it used to be understood by kings and queens in ancient societies that had those things, because the queen and the king knew that when their kingdom got into trouble and they needed to have an awful lot of people be soldiers to defend the kingdom, the more money they had, the easier and quicker it would be to acquire the horses and the outfits and the swords and the bullets and whatever else they needed, as well as hiring the people with whom you gave money, to whom you gave money. You could see it was a matter of life or death. So money has entranced people. When an economy exists, a young person growing up will quickly discover 2 or 3 years old is already enough, that there's something magical in a moment of generosity of your mother or your father. They will give you a little shiny coin, And even if you haven't the faintest idea what's printed on that coin, you will have picked up the emotion. This is a gift. This is something that's important to the giver as well as the receiver. You may not even know what it's for, although you'll learn quick enough that it's kind of magic. It's very important. When you lose a tooth in certain cultures, you place the tooth under the pillow, and a fairy is supposed to come during the night, take the tooth. It's never made quite clear to me why or what they do with that tooth, but they leave in its place money, a dollar bill or a quarter or some piece of money, and you are to consider yourself blessed. You are considered yourself ennobled in some way by this. So money has become a deeply ingrained fixture of modern economies long before capitalism ever existed. It turns out that money, if you want to ask the question, what is it? That you can't answer the question as if there was one thing it always is or was. Not true. Money, like almost everything else, varies with the context that overdetermines it, that makes it be what it is. I'll stop there.
Wow. No, so I'm kind of thinking of chapter 3 of Capital, volume 1, where the old man does this little exercise where, after demonstrating that all the commodities at Walmart can be placed in a certain exchange relationship with one another, and he gives it a fancy name, relative form, equivalent form, etc., etc. And then in chapter 3, he introduces money as the guy, as the universal commodity, if you like, which is going to act as the arbitrator of value, exchange value in that particular context. So one, it begs the obvious question that could any commodity, theoretically speaking, serve as money in this precise context, or does it have to be these metals or something that's recognized by the government? I mean, what do we know from history about this?
Well, what we know from history is that almost everything has been used as money. So the first level of answer has to be anything can play that role. And that kind of reinforces what I just said. What money is literally, what physical form it takes. And just so people know, money has been seashells, things you could pick up off the beach that are beautiful shells of the creatures of the sea that has been used as money. Uh, Food objects have been used as money. Animals have been used as money, and on and on and on. Whatever you can think of probably has been used by money somewhere. But the way I think you might understand it better is if we begin by saying, look, money would not be needed under two situations in an economy. And by economy, I simply mean a way of organizing the production and the distribution of goods and services. How do we do that? How do we convert a sheep into a woolen sweater? How do we convert a tree into a chair, and so forth? Uh, no matter how we go about it, the money question may or may not arise. I'll give you the example. Uh, I live in a rural area, many miles from anybody else. I live with my mother, my sister, my brother, and my uncle. Why not? And we farm the land and we raise the animals, and we are, simply for my example, as a group, self sufficient. We make everything we use. We are the producers and we are the consumers of what we produce. Okay, that's an economy. That's a way of organizing production and distribution. I produce it and then I distribute it to myself, all by myself. Or maybe I do it within a group, like my sister, my mother, my uncle, my brother. We're a group and we divide the labor amongst ourselves, maybe, and then we distribute. Once every week, we get together and I give the pot I made to you, and you give the shirt you made to her, and she gives the bananas she picked and cultivated to, we work it out. We distribute. In that situation, there really is no exchange and there's no money. We don't need it. We don't want it. And people who lived for centuries in those arrangements that I've just summarized did perfectly well without it. All right, now imagine a slightly different economy, maybe one that's gotten a little larger for whatever reason. And now we have what? My family, your family, his family, her family, and maybe, I don't know, 50 families. Call it a tribe if you like, call it a clan. It's had a lot of names, these kinds of arrangements, because they've existed for thousands of years. They still do in some parts of the world. Okay, now this is a group of people, and let's assume, again, for reasons we don't have time to go into, that they want to live together. Maybe they are kinfolk. They have some blood relation between them, or whatever it might be. They might arrange the following. You two people, you two families, the Smiths and the Browns, you make bread. Your job is to go out there, grow the wheat, and separate the seeds from the grain, etc., 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 and then bake the bread. And you other people, you make shirts, and you other people, you collect firewood, and so we can make little fire. You have a division of labor. And then here comes the interesting part. You make a decision, which took eons for this to develop evolutionarily. You make a decision that the way you're going to distribute is different from the way you're going to produce. Produce, you do individually in your home, in your workplace, which in these societies is usually the same place. Home, workplace, same thing. But you choose to distribute by organizing an institution. You don't leave it up to the bread person standing there yelling across the community center, who's got a shirt? I'm cold. I've got a loaf of bread here. I need a shirt. What you say is, let's organize this. Once a week on Saturday in the morning, we're going to go to this field right outside our little village here. And at that field, each of us will bring what we produce and offer it in exchange for what everybody else in the community wants. I don't know each week if you want bread. It's not my job. I'm going to make bread. I'm going to put it on a blanket on the ground. You can come and look at the bread, and you can touch it, and you can pick the bread you like. And then you can say to me, I want this bread. Good, I say. But I'm not going to give you the bread unless, of course, I get something, because that's our arrangement. And you can call the little field at the edge of town a name. The name is the market, because that's what it is. It's a place where exchange happens, where the producer of bread distributes it in the market for something else that the bread maker wants. Okay? That's a market. That's an exchange system. Still no money. Now this community hits a moment in its history where it notices something. You keep coming with your bread. You're very good. You keep the bread. You come and you put it out there. But you're not going to part with the bread unless there's somebody there who has something you want. But it turns out you were hoping for a shirt. But the people who make shirts sold out. They don't have any more. or they didn't make as many, or they were sick that day, or they couldn't get to the field on the edge of town in time. So you couldn't find anyone to sell your bread to. So you went home frustrated because you got more, you make enough bread for yourself, that's taken care of. But this was the bread you made to acquire a shirt with. You got no shirt, and you got a bread that no one needs at your house, and that will go stale in the next 24 hours. This community then invents. This is a human invention. It invents something we now call money. What is it? It is something that everybody will exchange for because it's got a magical quality, which is you can exchange it for anything. So now let's see how this solves the problem of our bread baker. He or she comes to the market. They've got the bread to sell. Nobody is there with the shirts. Do they go home frustrated? Do they go home without a shirt and with a bread going stale? No. They exchange the bread for the money in the society, for something, whatever plays the role of money. A seashell, a banana. Banana wouldn't be so good because that goes bad too, like the bread. But something that lasts. Why? Because this is a way of preserving the value of the bread they baked and they offer for sale. It's a way of holding on that you didn't have before. And you can hold on until tomorrow or next week when you can what? Use that thing to buy a shirt because the shirt person has the same mentality you do. You and the shirt person both believe that whatever the money item is will function in the way I've described. Obviously, if the shirt person doesn't agree, you got no deal here. You got no deal. They're not going to give up their shirt for whatever you acquired as the money economy, a money item, the seashell. They don't believe in the. What would be necessary for them to believe in the seashell? The answer, they would have to have had experience using the seashell to acquire something else. In other words, for a money to exist, there has to be social agreement on it being there and performing in the way I've described. And whether or not a society does that is always open to question. Let me drive that point home, because Marx doesn't do that because he has a different aim in the early part of Capital. Elsewhere he does. But do situations arise in societies that are used to money where they no longer trust the money? Yup, all the time. Does it happen today? Yup. There are countries right now that are having debates in their parliament that they've got to get rid of the money they have because people have no confidence that they can trust it. They're not going to give up something they made for this thing called money in that country because they're not sure anybody who has what they need will accept the money in exchange. So the people in the parliament debate, let's not use the money we've been using that our people don't believe in. Let's instead adopt the dollar or the Chinese yuan or the euro or something else because people believe in that. Well, yes, they believe in it now. Does that mean they always will? Nope. When Mr. Trump was elected, when he took office in January, the US dollar was the global currency par excellence. Today, it is worth roughly 10% less than it was in January when he became president. This president has presided over an incredible, because it's a short amount of time, losing 10% in less than 10 months. That's very unusual for a major global currency to be so unstable. And for those of you who didn't know this, particularly those of you that are Americans, welcome. You live in a country where the president makes sure you don't hear news that he's not comfortable explaining away. Okay, so money is an institution associated with another institution created by human beings to meet their needs. And you know what that means? It means, like every other institution, it doesn't drop from the heaven. It didn't drop fully formed. It isn't something superhuman or supernatural. And the last thing it isn't is something that determines us, because that misunderstands the game. We, the people, determine the market. We created it. In other words, for those of you with a religious background, Marx famously once wrote about his friend Feuerbach. Well, it was a friend, and they kind of had a falling out. Feuerbach was famous for daring to say the following: it isn't God that determined the human being, it's the other way around. It isn't the market that determines what happens in a human community. It's the human community that determines whether and when there is a market, as well as anything and everything that market is allowed to do. It's a fully human institution. It's like a school or a corporation or a picnic. What happens there is what you decide to make it do. You want to have a chance to get together with your friends in a lovely park and drink beer? Okay, you organize a picnic. The picnic doesn't tell you what you're going to do or what you're going to experience. You make the picnic. You make the school. You make the corporation, and you make the market. People who tell you that the market decides, and if I had time, I would quote to you virtually every member of the United States Senate and House of Representatives, if you check the congressional record, can be quoted as having said on occasion, "Let the market decide." That's ridiculous. That's like saying, if you don't like the way a room full of furniture looks, well, I don't like the way this room looks. We'll just let the chair decide. You can't do that because the chair lacks something. You have it, but the chair doesn't. We have it. The market doesn't. The market doesn't decide. And when you hear someone say that, it's because they don't want you to ask or answer the question, who actually is deciding here?
Well, so speaking of these magical properties that money has, Marx emphasizes that one such magical property that is peculiar to capitalism is the fact that money can be exchanged for labor power. That is to say, to cut a long story short, some people in this world are not born with money, and as a result, while others are, right? And the simplest definition my grandma gave me was that if you have a lot of money at the end of the month, you're a rich person. And if you have a lot of month at the end of the money, you're a poor person. And if you're in that latter category, Marx emphasizes that the only way you're going to eat every day and drink and have shelter and clothing is by selling your labor power to the guy who has the M. Now, can you walk us through the magical properties that money is endowed with under capitalism, whereby it can now extract surplus value from people by giving them a subsistence bundle? How does this magical property emerge in capitalism?
Well, I think if you allow me to do one or two steps before that, um, if you've understood the argument, then you can imagine that if the market and money are institutions human beings create, that anybody who has anything to sell might be very interested in having something be money that they have a lot of access to. Imagine, for example, how exciting it would be if we go back to my story with the two families that bake bread, if they could persuade their community to use bread as the money item. Wow. Then they would be in a remarkable position. What they make, bread, is immediately exchangeable for everything else made in that community because everybody accepts that bread is the money economy. The shirt people will take bread. Even if they wanted to get, I don't know, software, they'll take the bread and they'll hold it until the software comes along that they want, and then they'll use the bread as money to buy the software. So be very attractive for whoever produces the money economy because they would be in a much better position economically than everybody else. You might even begin to see other people seeing all this, beginning to spread the word. There might be something wrong with the bread. It's got bad things in it. It'll tarnish your hands when you touch it. You'll get stale. I have these little seashells. Ooh, they're much better. They don't go stale. They don't change. Everybody wants the privilege of being the money creator because of its role and all the magic. But the problem is, if a lot of people do it, then we are all troubled by the opposite of no money, which is too much money, too many different producers of money. I can't keep track. I'm just a producer of pots and pans, but I have to acquire my bread and I have to acquire my shirts. One guy wants to give me bread for money, another one wants to give me seashell. I don't even know if I take the seashell, should I have demanded bread? It becomes impossible. In the history of economies, that's exactly what's happened in most cases. Competing money producers. They want in on the magic of the money. They don't just want to produce a bread or a shirt or a piece of iron. They want to get a hold of the money because that's what you want, because that gives you access to everything. It's the universal exchangeable equivalent. And it's very exciting. But the whole society falls apart. It's the old joke. Be careful what you wish for, because if you get it, you may be sorry you tried. You don't want a lot of money. You want money, but you don't want a lot of money. Well, how are you going to manage this? Again, long story short, an agreement is reached that either only one or two recognized authorities are given the power to produce something the rest of us take as money, or maybe we'll have the government do it, not just another producer. That's too risky what they'll do with it. Let's give it to the government. And so in many societies, they gave it to the government. But then the government, of course, had its own problems, because when the government got into trouble, it would produce a vast amount of money to solve its problems. And now the money would be too much everywhere. We call that an inflation, because everybody is now demanding more and more of whatever that government is giving out, because they don't know how long this is going to last. There's too much of it. So you have to create an independent authority in the government, but not exactly, held back by bankers, the people who deal in money, and you hope they don't abuse the privilege they have. In the United States, we call that the Federal Reserve. It is a governmental institution, half controlled by bankers. And its job is to be independent. And we're having a big struggle in America right now because Mr. Trump wants to tell the Federal Reserve what to do. And the Federal Reserve is trying to tell him, you can't do that because if we're seen not to be independent, you're going to undercut the confidence in the dollar. Well, the very effort he's making has already done that, which is why it's 10% less valuable now. Rich people around the world who used to hold the dollar because it was as good as gold. Why gold? Because that became the money. It lasts forever. You can cut it up into little pieces. It doesn't wear out. It doesn't go stale. On and on and on. So people who were rich and wanted to hold their wealth had gold and dollars. They're getting rid of the dollars now because it's not reliable. Why? Because American capitalism is standing knee deep in doo-doo, and it's looking like a society going down. All right, having said all of that, now let me try to answer Sharam's question. And this is just Marx's way, early in Capital, of explaining what capitalism is about, the basic idea. So I'm going to use simple numbers to do it. I'm not going to use a blackboard because this is not complicated. And for those of you who are frightened by numbers, don't be. This is not difficult, I promise you. All right. Let's assume a producer of anything. I'm going to take as an example ladders, little wooden ladders that allow you to go up and down a few steps. Here's how capitalism works. The employer buys tools, equipment, and raw materials. He spends 100 of whatever the money is. He has 100 in money. Later on, we can talk about where he might have gotten it, but he has 100, and he buys lumber, nails, glue, saws, hammers, things to make ladders. Okay, now he's got the raw material and the tools. What else does he need? A worker. He needs a human being to use his or her brains and muscle to convert, to transform the lumber, the nail, the glue, the hammer from those things that it is into something else, something new, a ladder. And the ladder is more valuable than the tools, equipment, and raw materials used up to produce it. What's the difference? The value added by the laborer. Okay, that's the logic of this argument. And let's assume, again, for real simplicity, that the worker adds 100 units of a dollar, whatever money you want. So now we know what's going to happen. The employer, because you all know what capitalism is, the employer who paid for the tools, equipment, and raw material, 100, and who hired the worker and promised him a salary at the end of the day, produce a ladder. The ladder is worth 200. 100 tools, equipment, raw material in it, plus another 100 value added by the worker who converts those things into a finished ladder. The employer gets the ladder as fast as the worker produces it. Now, of course, if I had time, and Marx took the time, I would ask the question, wow, this must have quite an impact on the employer on the one hand and the employee on the other, because the employee did the work, but the employer got the product. And it went magically and instantaneously from the one to the other. But I won't go into that, even though it makes the employer think of himself as productive, even though he wasn't, because he got it. And it makes the employee feel ripped off because what he poured his soul into, his brains and his muscle, was taken away from him as fast as he produced it. But I won't go into that. I'm just going to go into what the employer does when he sells the ladder for the 200. He takes 100 and replaces the tools, equipment, and raw material used up so he can continue in the ladder business. And now we come to the crucial part. What does he give to the worker? And the answer is, I'm going to use a typical number, 50 bucks. He pays the worker less than the value added by the worker when he works. Why does he do that? Answer: because if he didn't do it, if he gave to the worker 100, which is what the worker added by his labor, then there would be nothing in it for the employer. And that would require him to be an idiot. Employers in general, with many exceptions, are not idiots. They're not going to play this game called capitalism unless they get a profit. And the only way they can get a profit, let me drive this home, friends, even though it'll trouble you. The only way the employer gets a profit is by getting the worker to accept whatever is offered, in this case, 50. And to do that, the worker has to believe that it is in some sense appropriate, fair. How shall I put it? It has to be acceptable. Because in the extreme, the worker can say to the employer, 50, and at that point, raise his middle finger. At that point, we got a real problem. Because the capitalist system has to have workers who agree to add value by their work that they don't get. So a worker who says to himself or herself or to their friends and family, I will never work for an employer who doesn't pay me what I'm worth, that's a person who doesn't understand the system. You will never have a job that pays you what you're worth, because that's the condition of your employment. You only get enough to reproduce your capacity to work, because that's what the employer cares about. He don't want to give you more than that. He wants to get the difference between the value you add by your labor and what he has to pay you to do that labor. That's the game. And if you want to know why capitalists leave the United States and move to China, it's because they can give workers less there than they can in the United States, or at least that used to be the situation. If you want to understand it, now you grasp, I hope, why this system is constantly convulsed by strikes, by abuse of one kind or another. The capitalist is better off the less he can get away with paying the worker. There's a constant incentive to screw the worker out of whatever wage you pay. We have an immigration problem. You know why we have 12 million undocumented immigrants? Because there are employers who love the idea of an undocumented immigrant. Why? Because when Friday comes, you don't even pay him the 50. You pay him 30. And you say to him, you don't like it? Don't come back. You want to go to the cops? They'll throw you out of the country. An undocumented worker is a worker who will accept almost anything because that's how desperate they are. Wow, that teaches the employer to look upon people without any empathy, without any fellow feeling as a human being. That poisons the culture of a society that organizes itself in this way. That's why Marx was a critic. He thought we could do better. Maybe we could get together and work together. No employer-employee. Stop. That's no better than master-slave, which was another way of getting the work done. Or lord and serf. Employer-employee. Who needs this? Tiny group of people at the top whose incentive is to screw the majority under their control at the workplace. For those of you who believe in democracy, ask yourself, why was democracy excluded from day one inside capitalist enterprises, such that the owner or the manager or the board of directors, a tiny group of people, are telling everybody else what to do, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, what to do with the product? That's the most undemocratic arrangement imaginable. And if democracy is useful in the neighborhood where you reside, tell me why it isn't useful in the workplace where you labor. And the answer is capitalism is the opposite of democracy. Capitalism requires no democracy. Democracy would mean that the workers together produce the 100 value added, and then they all decide together, democratically, one person, one vote, what to do with the 100 that their labor has added. You know what you don't need in that story? An employer. It's a little bit like the recognition of the peasants hundreds of years ago. They kept worrying all their lives. The landlord will throw us off the land, until a radical came up and said, you know something? I got news for you. Right away after we shoot the landlord, you're going to notice something. The land is still there.
Thank you very much, Professor Wolff. As always, that was inspiring. Folks, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but typically think about this. When someone asks you about money in capitalism, you typically think about pieces of paper with, I don't know, pictures of Benjamin Franklin or Mr. Gandhi or Mao Zedong on them. But here's an interesting quote with which I'd want to conclude today's discussion. Marx says in Capital Volume 2 that the characteristic irrationality of capitalism is not that money can be exchanged for the commodity called labor power, but rather the fact that we have all accepted that labor power can and should be sold and bought as a commodity. All right, guys, I hope you got something out of it. I'll see you all next week. Take care.